Jamil's interest cross-cuts some of the ones we have already heard about this morning: artificial intelligence, intellectual property, machine learning, cybersecurity, and fundamental rights. And his particular emphasis is on jihadi groups and social media. So please, Jamil, proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate it. Okay. I'm sharing, if you don't mind, my slides with you. Are you able to see the slides before we proceed?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So a month or so, Samuel Paty, a French teacher, was killed in France for allegedly showing or discussing controversial cartoons around the Prophet Muhammad. It was a complete shock worldwide, because after all, Mr. Paty is a teacher, or was a teacher, and this is exactly what teachers do. They discuss things. Now, what was interesting in this tragedy, not only the killing of Samuel Paty, but equally important, the method of execution. Because Mr. Paty, unfortunately, was beheaded. Now, this is very important message, at least in the context of cybersecurity. Now, to understand the symbolic gesture of beheading here, one needs to go no further than one of the, really, if you would like, a blueprint of Daesh savagery. It's a book written by one of the most prolific and prestigious ISIS followers. His name was Abu Bakr Naji, killed a few years ago. Abu Bakr Naji wrote a book entitled Management of Savagery. In this book, he highlights, if you would like, the rationale of using extreme violence, extreme savagery. So, for example, in this book, he explains the essence or the reason why a terrorist group should, for example, or the context in which tons of TNT should be used. I oppose a few hundred grams enough to do the job of killing a human being. So beheading is one of the key, if you would like, atrocity that the book advocates for. And there is a reason. Whenever a terrorist group such as ISIS wants to send a message, beheading is very clear and loud message. This is how they do it. In fact, beheading became, unfortunately so popular that whenever we see an image like the one on the right side of screen here, to the late Japanese journalist with a knife, pretty much everyone knows what's going to happen. So the point here is that this atrocity, this terrorist act was committed by ISIS, and there is, few people could doubt this fact. Of course, ISIS followers have celebrated this atrocity all over the place, all over social media. They have bombarded YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, you name it, with images similar to this one here. It's depicting Emmanuel Macron as the Satan or the devil. But today's presentation is not about ISIS followers. It is, in fact, about completely different type of online users. It's about users who historically neither support al-Qaida nor ISIS. In fact, in some cases, some online supporters I'm going to address today have even fought and bled at the head of terrorist groups such as al-Qaida and ISIS. There are unfortunately, tons of examples to share. I'm going to use the three today. If you look at the left side here, the one I'm highlighting, this is, for example, a post to one of the prestigious, highly celebrated Syrian moderate opposition who is not known by any standard to support or follow any terrorist group, full stop. He is followed by a few hundred thousands on Facebook. The image here showing the celebration or the condemnation of Emmanuel Macron response to Charlie Hebdo's events. If you look to the other side of the screen, you will see here in the blue, it's in Arabic language. This is a survey conducted exactly months ago on Telegram. If you look down there, you will see around 2,293 people participated. The survey asked the people's view about the events unfolded after the killing of Symposium al-Batteh, literally the stabbing of a few people at one of the churches in Nice in France. Whopping 55% believed that, in fact, the whole stabbing things was staged by the French government to turn people against Islam and Muslims. Even more troubling, 28% supported stabbing civilians. Now, only 17% refused such an act. Now, this is, you might say, okay, perhaps this is the Middle East. How about Europe? So in the middle here, I'm sharing with you script of a video. This is a demonstration took place in Germany. Now, at second minute, 38 seconds precisely, you could hear what I would consider, among many other, very incendiary and controversial chants condemning not only the German government, but providing support to extreme groups. So this is in the middle of Europe. So the question is this: how come a group of online users, many of them do not support al-Qaida nor ISIS, and still, perhaps inadvertently, celebrated the massacre or the terrorist act of beheading a French teacher for doing literally his job? Now, to understand this troubling concept, we need to pay attention to one particular aspect of the school of thought called Wahhabism. Now, in some parts of the world, for example, in Canada and the United States, a political party or politicians need to win election to rule. If they don't win elections, they will have no legitimacy. Now, in some other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East and the Muslim world, fair elections are hard to come by. But political leaders still needs legitimacy. So they usually refer to religion to get this legitimacy. In particular, one concept is relevant here. It is obedience. So basically, most, if you would like, theocratic and autocratic regimes in the Muslim world used to publicize a very grim and puritanic interpretation of faith that is based on the literal, slavish interpretation of text. In particular, they highlight some text related to the concept of obedience. There are a few Quranic verses, hadith, and teaching by prestigious and well-respected Muslim scholars call upon Muslims to follow their leaders. So under this interpretation of faith, under Salafism, Muslims are expected, in fact, to follow their leaders. Now, you could, if you see something wrong, you could always advise. You say, well, this is wrong. This should be done the other way. However, providing advice is one thing, and protesting and revolting is a completely other thing. Under the Salafi or Wahhabi school of thought, if you do revolt against a Muslim leader, you could run the risk of being branded unbeliever. And this is very serious crime in many areas of the world. Apostasy in Islam is a crime punishable by death. That's why whenever we have an issue like this, moderate Muslims have to think very seriously before criticizing any Islamic authority, because the risks here are enormous. Now, theocratic and autocratic regime insist a lot on this slavish interpretation of faith, because under the obedience principle, it serves them. And under what I call, religious cronyism, dictator systems or regimes, they appoint those religious figures who are more politicians, by the way, than religious figures, who try to depict the dictator as a faithful. He prays 5 times and he allows the Muslim to do their religious duties. And that pretty much enough, because once you depict someone as a faithful leader under the strict interpretation of Wahhabism, you as a Muslim are not in position to challenge this leader, no matter how corrupted he might be. Now,
Jamil,
yep.
Excuse me for just a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a request to have your slides bigger. Do you think you could play slideshow?
Yes, of course. How about this?
Perfect.
Thank you. I tried to minimize the text and enlarge the font upon your request, so hopefully this is clear enough. Now, so in addition to this, if you would like, political advantages, where the literal interpretation of faith, in fact, serves dictatorship, authoritative regime in some part of the Muslim world, this slavish interpretation of faith creates a serious problem in the context of fighting terrorism. So let us ask this question: how popular Wahhabism is? To answer this question, my colleague, Professor Suhu, and I, for 4 years, conducted a series of research to scan online media. We did a couple of things. The first one, we surveyed one of the most popular scholars in the Islamic world in both Arabic and English languages. We identified a sample of 135. Some of those scholars are followed by 25 million followers on Twitter. Others have up to 11 million followers on Facebook. We highlighted and analyzed part of their literature posted online. In addition to that, we have followed 2 propaganda campaigns conducted online. One perpetrated by a moderate Islamic group and another one conducted by jihadi group. Both campaigns lasted for 18 months. We analyzed in the just under 5,000 posts. And we came to the following conclusion. Our research shows that apart from a single yet significant concept, which is whether or not to resort to violence to achieve political or religious goals, both Salafi groups and jihadi groups are ideologically aligned. So from this perspective, jihadi groups really don't have to do the hard work. The heavy lifting is already done by the Salafi groups, but the Salafi groups are baseful. In 99% of groups, Salafi groups do not resort to violence. So the only thing remaining here is for a jihadi group like such as ISIS to push the envelope one step ahead, which is to use violence. Now, how popular this? Well, again, based only on the data we analyzed, we concluded that 76.7% of all the material we highlighted or analyzed falls under the definition of Wahhabism or Salafism, meaning the strict interpretation of faith. Now, how is that relevant to our topic today? Well, it's relevant in this way. To many online users, what happened to Mr. Bate was not a crime, because they have been spoon-fed for ages this slavish or strict interpretation of faith. They've been exposed to many religious texts that dictate whoever, for example, insult the Prophet should be killed. So for those online users, the Prophet was insulted. Mr. Patel discussed this controversial cartoon. He was killed. He did something wrong. Death was the punishment. That's the end of the story. So to those thousands and thousands of online users, it was not necessarily about ISIS and its crime. That was something much bigger than that, beyond that. Because if you look into some of the material published online, the name Samuel Bate rarely mentioned. The focus is on this. This is a war in Islam. This is a war in Muslim. No one even cares to talk about free speech and religious freedom. and they condemn the French government, and that's the end of the story. And the argument goes almost like verbatim, stating, how about the illegal invasion of the American to Iraq? How about the war in Yemen? How about the conflict between Israeli and the Palestinian? And yet somehow Mr. Patel is lost in this debate. So it's so easy at this stage to say, okay, anyone goes online and directly or indirectly celebrates the atrocity, the terrorist act against Mr. Patel is an ISIS follower. The fact is much more complicated than that. The fact is, interestingly, much harder than that. And it would be really a mistake to depict all those going online as an ISIS supporter, despite the fact their literature, at least indirectly, fuels, if you would like, such terrorist events. Now, what do we do about that? Well, this is hardly a new problem. We have dealt with terrorism for years now. There are a number of responses here. We have the legal or legislative response, where you can go to the court to delete a certain text. There is the technical response. You refer to social media companies to do something about it. And of course, there is the third societal approach where you counter, if you like, or present counter argument. Today I'm going to focus on the technical response, but I need to say a few words about the legislative response because it's important and relevant. So, okay, what's wrong with courts? Why courts don't step up and deal with such clearly incendiary literature? What's wrong of going to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court of the United States, or the European Court of Human Rights? Well, again, we have reviewed a countless number of cases. You can think of Kegstra case in Canada, Brandenburg, Ohio in the United States, or Turkey number 9 before European Court of Human Rights. In all these cases, the essence or the conclusion you can drive is that the law, given protection given to free speech and religious freedom, law is of little help of assistance here. Courts in both sides of the Atlantic are inclined to, if you would like, apply any draconian method of deleting controversial religious texts. Because from free speech perspective, the focus isn't in fact on the nature of the ideas expressed, but rather on its effect. So for example, I'm talking about jihadi groups, but let me use example elsewhere. In Christianity and Judaism, faithful Christians should observe the Sabbath. People should not or are not supposed to work on Sunday. Those who work on Sunday are supposed to be killed. But how many people are killed for working on Sunday? I can't think of any. So this is the religious text that justifies violence within certain contexts, but that doesn't mean that people follow. Quran is the same. Islam is the same. Quran justifies violence in certain conditions. And the overwhelming majority of people do not resort to violence. Courts understand this, and that's why they don't, if you would like, cave to pressure. And for a good reason. Salafism today is the fastest growing school of Islam in the world. So while people ask, how come a few people became radicalized and joined ISIS? In fact, the real question, given the fact that the followers, the Salafi, the peaceful Salafis, who are constantly subject to an extra dose of violence, they live the same life experience, and they adhere almost to the same faith like al-Qaida and ISIS. It is really a miracle that only few people join the rank of terrorist groups. Again, courts understand the logic. That's why courts insist and they stress not to mix things, extreme ideologies with violence. That's why even controversial religious texts, be it Quranic verses or fatwas, are not banished under free speech or constitutional law, meaning are not sponsored. Now, given this embodiment, of course, politicians refer to private sectors. because ultimately private sectors such as social media companies are profit-seeking companies. They are not required to follow constitutional law. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg and others would like to pretend they are, they support free speech and they advance democracy, but the bottom line here is achieving profit. And why politicians, of course, refer to private companies and they push to do something? Well, simply because they try to do it differently. It didn't work very quickly. 2 years ago, in the aftermath of the killing of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the Canadian government posted a tweet, a basic tweet talking about human rights in general. After a couple of hours, the Saudi government frozen or canceled an arms deal that was worth $1 billion Canadian dollar. At that time, 2 countries only, Germany and Canada, protested the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. The British government, the American administration, among others, reached out to the Saudis and they gave them more weapons. So politicians understood that this is very costly business. That's why, again, they seem to paying more attention to private sector. Perhaps they could do it indirectly. Now, how private sectors or profit-seeking enterprises such as social media platforms are supposed to do the job? How they are supposed to differentiate between religious speech, hate speech, or political speech? Now, we are presented with a magical technology, machine learning technology that is usually used by social media company. The technology is presented as a silver bullet that will pretty much solve at least part of our problem. In the context of fighting terrorism, I strongly debate this idea. I do believe that the technology is not here yet. In fact, the technology, while is capable of, let me say, doing billions of math equations with a second, that doesn't necessarily mean the technology is smarter than us, a human. To this point, power should not be equated with intelligence, because counterterrorism is language, culture, and geography specific. Now, if you follow some of the statement pointed by companies leaders, I'm just citing Facebook as an example. I don't like to pick on Facebook. They are so optimistic, saying that 98% of hate speech will be instigated automatically before even our users say it. Well, this is quite questionable statement, and let me tell you quickly why. Well, let's look at the scale of the job. First of all, citing Facebook alone, you have 2.7 billion monthly users online. How much data those billions generate? You have more than 100 languages used on Facebook alone. I'm not talking Instagram, I'm not talking Telegram, I'm not talking Snapchat. So the job is too big. Secondly, despite allegations made by tech companies that the technology is there and it's very smart, in fact, the technology is not smart. Let me give you some evidence. In 2017, YouTube algorithm completely wiped up the entire archive of human rights organization based on the UK. An organization documenting war crime committed in the Middle East lost its entire archive due to mistake committed by YouTube algorithm. Another mistake by the algorithm, a gentleman, using Google autofill looking for information about the Holocaust, Google directed the user to Nazi-related websites. Now, I understand what you might be saying. You say, come on, Jamil, that was in 2017. Now we are 2020, and technology years like dog years. Time goes very fast. Surely technology now is much better. Well, you are wrong. Now, I'm going to show you some evidence now related to the Daesh or ISIS.
And Jamil, I have to tell you, this is your 5-minute warning, okay?
Okay, thank you. So before joining the presentation, this is just a channel. At the left here, you will see an ad by Al-Furqan. This is ISIS online platform. It is more than 8 years old. No question about it is affiliation with ISIS. Pointing that they are going to post something within a few hours on this Telegram channel, Salahuddin Hadath. You look at Salahuddin Hadath, it is there on Telegram. If you look here, there are 5,663 followers on Telegram today following the news of this channel. You might be asking, okay, how come exactly ISIS is capable still to have a presence online? Well, the answer is simple, because they have changed their media campaign. So if you go to the channel, you will never read the Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, al-Qaida. You will so they use different language. They avoid using as any keyword related to violence. And that's why, from legal perspective, the material, while it does support ISIS propaganda, it is legal. It could be controversial, but it is legal. Now, what to do about that? Well, given that other options are not exactly visible, including exerting political pressure on the Saudis, among many others, to refrain from publicizing this grim and bureaucratic interpretation of faith, we left with a few options, one of them the technical option. Now, with the technical option, given that most companies use machine learning technology, in particular unsupervised machine learning technology, we really know very little how the technology, specifically the algorithm, works. So basically, there is a real risk here to avoid any potential litigation that tech companies will err on side of deleting legitimate stuff that has no real bearing or link with extremes or terrorist groups. So we need someone to look under the hood. We need someone to understand how the algorithm used, how machine learning system used by social media actually works. Now here I'm not talking about Facebook Supreme Court, where 20 people, appointed by Facebook. This is media stunt. We need something much more serious than that. So I believe we could learn from the European here. The European faced, different but related problem. A few years ago, when the biotechnology became very popular, courts faced the challenge of dealing with this tech-heavy sector. Judges struggled to deal with it. So they established a special courts from people specialized in both law and technology. Those judges will get special training so they can respond to challenging faced by biotechnology. I'm suggesting something similar. And the task of this international body should be to do two things, provide two things. The first one is evidence-based decision-making, because the last thing we want today is to equate extreme ideas with violence. So for example, while most jihadi groups use Islam to justify their crimes, from counter-terrorism perspective, it would be a mistake to equate Islam as such with violence. The second thing, certification. Given the preparatory nature of algorithms, and we don't know, perhaps this group of qualified people would be able to test the extent to which the technology is free speech friendly. So at least we have some example to verify the result that social companies would like us to believe. I will stop at this stage and would be happy to answer your question during the end. Thank you so much for listening.